Welcome to another of our NWBA midweek reflections, which you are, of course, allowed to watch at weekends, but we offer them alongside our Sunday online worship gatherings, so that's kind of why we call them midweek. And it's great to have had feedback from a number of churches who are using these in small groups, so thanks for letting us know that you appreciate them. And again, please subscribe to our channel if you want to get a notification of when new ones come out. You know, the one thing that my family always tells me is that I take too long to tell stories. Now, my argument is that you need to explain all the background information. Otherwise, it's just not going to make sense. But then where do you begin? Because if you start too far back, then people get fed up listening before you get to the main point. But if you start too far the other way, then you get to the main point and people don't quite understand all the background that goes with it. But yeah, I'll admit it, I probably do go into too much detail. But that question of where do we start the story was clearly something that the gospel writers faced when they set out to create their accounts of the life of Jesus. Now, Mark, we think, was the first one on the scene, and he just decided to go for it and to hit the ground running, so to speak. And so we're introduced to Jesus launching into his adult ministry, and by the end of the opening chapter, he's called his first disciples, he's healed half the population of Capernaum, and cleansed a leper. And Mark kind of invites us to draw our conclusions about the identity of Jesus by dropping in these kind of big hints into his adult narrative. So, for example, the phrase, only God can forgive sins, just after Jesus has pronounced that someone's sins are forgiven. Or after he's stilled a storm on Lake Galilee, the question, who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? Which, if you've read the book of Psalms, is a pretty common way of describing God. So Mark kind of leaves us to draw our conclusions about the identity of Jesus by following the narrative of his adult life. But Luke decides to trace those roots back a little bit further. And so he invites us to draw a lot of our conclusions about Jesus's identity from the narratives that surround his birth. He's the one who tells us about Mary and Elizabeth and the shepherds and Joseph and there being no room at the inn. And he's sort of rooting Jesus and John the Baptist in another strong biblical tradition, which is to present key figures in the narrative as having had unusual and often divinely appointed births. So he's kind of placing Jesus in that mold. He wants us to know that he's of the house and the line of David. He wants us to know that he's born in Bethlehem. He wants us to know that his birth came about because of the action of God. Now, of course, he still includes plenty of episodes from his adult life that reinforce that. But he also makes the point that this identity of Jesus was forged from the very beginning of his life. Now, Matthew takes us back even further. Lots of people reckon that he particularly had a Jewish readership in mind. And so he wanted to connect Jesus with the great ancestral figures of the Jewish faith. And so he constructs a family tree, a kind of first century equivalent of the TV program Who Do You Think You Are? And he places Jesus in the line of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the 12 tribes that make up the nation of Israel. And yes, he also gets David and Solomon in there and some of the great kings from the Old Testament too. So we have these three gospels that each in their own way takes us back to the beginning of the story. But then along comes John. And John just takes it into a whole other dimension because he goes right back to the beginning. I mean, the beginning of everything. And not only that, but he takes the story outside simply of human history into eternity itself. Anyway, don't take my word for it. Let's read the opening verses of John's account of the life of Jesus, which not surprisingly is John's Gospel, chapter 1, and beginning to read at verse 1. And this is what it says. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And in him was life, and that life was the light of all humanity. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And then we go down to verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So, like I said, John takes us to the very beginning of time, of creation. And he says this is where the story of the life of Jesus begins. From the outset, Jesus was God. Jesus was with God. Jesus was part of the bringing into being of everything. And he even quite deliberately uses the same phrase to open his gospel that the writer of the Old Testament book of Origins, the book of Genesis, uses to open that one, in the beginning. And I want you to stop and think about that for a moment, because what John is saying here is that when you become a follower of Jesus, you're not just buying in to some profound and meaningful teaching, although Jesus produced plenty of that, and you're not simply pledging your allegiance to a wonderful person, though again, the narratives of the life of Jesus imply that he was just that too. But he's saying that when you become a follower of Jesus, you are invited to root your story in God's story. John's vision of Jesus was all-encompassing. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and the life was the light of all humanity. And I want to invite you to think about that for a moment. Your story is rooted in God's story. Because for many of us at the moment, our story is probably quite a challenging and difficult one. And that could be for a whole load of reasons. Perhaps you're having to live in isolation, or you're shielding, or maybe you're struggling because you haven't been able to spend time with the ones you love. And some of that time where you can't just get back. And I know that some of my friends have lost loved ones through coronavirus, and some have been struck down by it. And okay, they've recovered to a degree. But I know it's left a lot of people feeling quite seriously weakened and wondering if they'll ever quite be the same again. Or maybe you're a key worker, and yes, you're delighted to be doing your bit, but it's tough. It makes demands on you, and there's very little respite. Or maybe you're worried about your job, or already having to manage on a significantly reduced income, and so I could go on. And that's just in relation to COVID-19. But as our friends in the Black Lives Matter movement have reminded us in recent days, that's not the only issue that some people are having to face and struggle with at the moment. Now, at one level, that phrase, the word became flesh and made a dwelling among us, may sound quite uplifting and inspiring, and words of inspiration can help us at a time like this. But we need more than that. And I want to think about the difference these statements actually make to the everyday business of our lives. So let me take you back to what I said at the beginning. This is just one way of beginning the story of the life of Jesus. And each of those other gospel writers hasn't somehow got it wrong by failing to connect the narrative in the way that John does. They're just looking at the same set of circumstances from different perspectives. And I want to suggest that that's something that can often help us when circumstances are difficult, to look at them from different perspectives. And so those phrases like the word was God and the word became flesh root the stories that the other gospel writers tell in this big story of who God is. And when we realize that, then we remember that these stories were very difficult and challenging stories. I mean, Mark presents the adult Jesus as someone who was often misunderstood and challenged. The birth narratives that Luke relates were often fraught with difficulty and struggle. You have Mary and Joseph forced to travel to Bethlehem because of a worldwide pandemic of Roman oppression. And if everyone had returned to their family's hometown, as we're told, then the whole of Joseph's family would have been there. So how come there was no room for them in the inn? How come they were left on their own? Well, I suspect it was because of the circumstances surrounding Mary's pregnancy. The family didn't want them. And then there's an appalling act of slaughter that breaks out in the wake of Jesus' birth, and they're left having to flee to another country as refugees. There is a whole catalogue of things that would, at a human level, present us with massive challenges. But this is a story that is rooted in God's story. And then take a look at that big list of names in Matthew's Gospel. They represent era after era of history. some of which were remembered as the great glory days of the ancient kings like David, but many others were eras of oppression and strife and famine and invasion and exile. And of course, all these different stories, these different gospel stories, might start in different places, but each of the narratives comes to its focus at the cross, in an act of appalling brutality and injustice. Now, no one is saying here, cheer up, it's not as bad as things were for Jesus. But what I think we can say is, yes, things may be difficult and tough for us at the moment, but these things should never make us doubt that we are still part of God's story. In fact, I wonder whether recent events have perhaps challenged us to realise that we have sometimes created the impression that being part of God's story means we have to have an easy and well-resourced life. But so many words of Jesus, so many episodes of his life remind us that that just isn't so. And so if we're struggling, that's the time we need to know that our story is rooted in God's story, not feel that we've been cut adrift. And I think that's what the Jesus story tells us. You know, so many of the Psalms in the Old Testament are written in situations of real struggle and peril. And much of their narrative is the writer just pouring out the anguish of their heart. But often, the consolation comes not because there's suddenly some miraculous turn of events, but they remember who God is. They remember the bigger story that they're part of, and that kind of brings the reorientation that they're seeking. So I want to invite you to use these words from John's Gospel to help you reflect on the fact that if you are a follower of Jesus, then your story is rooted in God's story. So find the time and space you need to let these words dwell richly in your heart. And here are some ways that you might want to look at this. First of all, just spend some time thinking about your own story. Don't try and bury your fears and concerns, or for that matter, your joys and your gratitudes. And then try to reflect on those things from the perspective of being rooted in God's story. And one dimension of that is time. It's a long time since the beginning, and God's story has been unfolding for a lot longer than present events, which will pass. So try to see your presence in that perspective. Yes, things have been difficult for some weeks now, and they will have taken their toll. But try to see those weeks, try to even see the span of your whole lifetime from the perspective of the whole of human history, in which God has always been a part. And then maybe try and see the completeness of God's story. Without God, nothing was made, says John. Our struggles are not the only struggles in the world. Our concerns and fears are not the only concerns and fears. And they will only become all-consuming if we allow them to become all-consuming. So try to not be dominated just by your own experiences, but see that bigger picture. And then you might like to reflect on what I call the transcendence of God's story. John places a whole series of very human events in the context, as I said earlier, of eternity. His image of God transcends time itself. God is at work in dimensions and realms that are way beyond our understanding. And through Jesus, our identity and our future becomes bound up in that eternity. So try to see present events from the perspective of eternity. And that leads me on to another aspect, which is perhaps to reflect on what I might call the enigma of God's story. What I mean by that is this phrase, "we have seen his glory," is one that John uses in his gospel, not to refer to some great vision of God's splendor and majesty. It's how he describes the events of the cross. We have seen God's glory, he says, in the most harrowing of human circumstances. So yeah, things maybe don't make sense for you at the moment, but it doesn't mean that your story is any less rooted in God's story. We don't even need to be able to make sense of things to be part of God's story, because God's story doesn't always make sense, at the time. And then perhaps all of these things come together with the simple invitation to see our circumstances in the light of the sheer magnitude of who God is. He was God and he was with God. And all of those phrases like King of Kings and Lord of Lords and beginning and end, none of them fully do justice to all that God is. So just allow yourself to remember that God is so, so much bigger than anything that confronts us. And then finally, just let that phrase, "Word became flesh," resonate with you for a while. God's word offers us so much more than some helpful explanations of things. It speaks of God being present. Your story being rooted in God's story means you can know the reality of Emmanuel, God with us, right at the heart of your present experiences. So take some time to seek God's presence in the here and now. Those stories, those events in the Gospels, some of which were pretty difficult, were seen by the writers of evidence of God's presence, even in the midst of human struggle. So don't just think about God. Reach out for God's presence with you. And as I always say, if you can encourage someone else to watch this reflection and then spend some time together supporting and encouraging each other, or even consoling each other as you share what God has said to you through it, then I'd encourage you to do that. So I hope that in a small way these thoughts help you to root your story in God's story. Thanks for listening.